Continuing here on endocrine pathologies. So a lot of times the problem is at the level of receptors. You might end up with a downregulation of receptors, either decreased number of receptors, or you have too much insulin, for example, in the blood, and that will decrease the number of receptors. It's sort of in response, it's just overload, and we want to decrease the sensitivity to the insulin in this case. Also, receptor and signal transduction abnormalities could happen. There's something called testicular feminization syndrome. That means that these kids are actually born genetically as boys, so XY on the genetics, but they are born with ambiguous genitalia, usually by default being assigned to be a girl. And then once they hit puberty, all of a sudden the massive amounts of testosterone cause them to now look more like a boy. So that's called testicular feminization syndrome. We have a case study like that in the lab manual, which we'll be doing at the end of the semester. Another case of receptor or signal transduction abnormality would be pseudo hypothyroidism, which is not going to be something that we'll pick up again. But here are some some diagrams showing that the levels of the different hormones usually reveal where the problem might be. So here is the example of cortisol given. Here will be the pathologies in the adrenal cortex itself. So that means maybe the adrenal cortex has turned cancerous and is over-secreting cortisol. Now you have increased levels of cortisol, but you're constantly sending negative feedback back to the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, which means these increased levels of cortisol together with decreased levels of ACTH from the pituitary. Now this one you can't detect in the blood, but these two here would reveal that the problem must be at the level of the gland itself, because we have decreased level of ACTH in this case. This scenario here is the hypersecretion is due to a pituitary problem. So now the pituitary is making way too much ACTH, so the adrenocorticotropic hormone, and that's directing the gland to make tons of cortisol. And so then in this case you have too much cortisol along with too much ACTH, and so that would pinpoint the problem to the anterior pituitary itself. So it could be a tumor in the pituitary that's making too much ACTH. And here you have the problem that there's a tumor in the hypothalamus, and now we're making too much CRH, and that would mean that the anterior pituitary is making too much ACTH, and then the gland, of course, is making too much cortisol. So when all three of these are elevated, that would pinpoint the problem to the hypothalamus in this case. So here we are given a scenario on A of hyposecretion from damage to the pituitary. So let's think about that. If the anterior pituitary is damaged, then we would have decreased levels of ACTH. That would mean we have not much, if any, cortisol around. That means we have symptoms of deficiency, and of course we would try to send negative feedback here to the actually positive feedback in this case back to the hypothalamus. We're trying to tell the hypothalamus there's not enough cortisol, so the CRH levels would be high, but the pituitary can't respond because there's damage right there. So that pattern would be low pituitary, low on the actual gland, the cortisol secretion, and high CRH production. Here in this scenario, we're given hyposecretion from atrophy of the adrenal cortex. So that means the adrenal cortex doesn't work. So that means we can't make much cortisol, if any, because the adrenal cortex is damaged. Now, the feedback loops will still work. Lack of cortisol or not enough cortisol would mean that we're going to increase production of CRH at the level of the hypothalamus. The anterior pituitary responds with an increased level of ACTH, and but the adrenal cortex can't respond. So in this case, we would have high ACTH levels that we could measure and low cortisol, and then the symptoms of deficiency, of course, and that would point here at the level of the gland itself. Now, I'm going to have a few more slides here on chapter 23. That's sort of the attachment on continuation of chapter 7 on the endocrine control. In this case here, we're going to do growth and metabolism. So for growth, of course, that growth would be growth hormone right here, and metabolism, that is going to be the thyroid hormones. And we're just going to take a look at how these hormones might work, and also take a look at some more of the pathologies. So the review of endocrine principles, well, we just went through this, so we can do this really quickly. The hypothalamus, pituitary, the actual gland, this three-tiered system that we constantly were talking about in the previous slides. Feedback patterns, hormone receptors, cellular responses, all of this we just went through here would be the adrenal glands sitting on top of the kidneys. We have of course, the adrenal cortex region right here with the cortisol secretion, and then the adrenal medulla with the epinephrine, norepinephrine. But anyway, so here your three-tiered system. Let's take the cortisol axis here as our example. The hypothalamus makes the CRH, the corticotropin releasing hormone, that would stimulate the anterior pituitary to make ACTH, the adrenocorticotropic hormone, and that would act on the adrenal cortex to make cortisol, which is your stress hormone. It's nice. Cortisol is actually not too bad. It gives you a boost of energy. It sort of kicks your butt a little bit to get studying. But if it's too much, of course, it will cut into your sleeping time. Your heart rate will increase. You will feel worn out, and if it's really long-term stress and too much cortisol for a long time, then your immune functions go down. You start getting sick more easily, and it's not a good thing. So short-term stress may not be such a bad thing. It gives you a boost of energy and gets things done, but long-term stress certainly is not such a good thing. So here, circadian rhythms of cortisol secretion. It's kind of interesting here real quick. A lot of times we think that throughout any given day, the levels of certain hormones are steady, which is not the case. So cortisol secretion, of course, it makes sense that it varies actually. So that's the reason why I like 10 o'clock lectures, because right here, so you're getting up in the morning and cortisol levels are not very high, and then you come to school, and if you have like a 10 o'clock class, it's like perfect because your attention levels are really high. You don't have much of a tendency to fall asleep in lecture, and so I really like that lecture block right around 10 o'clock because your cortisol level and your ability to concentrate, your energy levels are high sort of in the morning hours, and then it goes down at noon. Lecture right after lunch is very difficult to stay awake. So anyway, don't try that. I hate lectures right after lunch. Everybody's asleep, and it's nothing anybody can do really. So anyway, the point here is that our levels of hormones, many hormones, they fluctuate throughout the day, and that's called circadian rhythmicity. Here's the rap sheet of cortisol. You can take a look at that, whatever you find interesting. The half-life is actually not too long, 60 to 90 minutes, an hour and a half. Of course, it's a steroid hormone. You can take a look at some of the other numbers here and pieces of information. Well, cortisol is essential for life. It promotes gluconeogenesis. That's what I just said. It promotes this boost of energy that we experience when you have some stress. But long-term stress is not a good thing because it kind of wears you down and it suppresses your immune system. That's the big problem for long-term stress. So cortisol, like other steroids, it would suppress your immune function. It's anti-inflammatory, which is good short-term or maybe locally speaking. But it's not a good thing in the long term. If you suppress your entire immune system, it makes you much more likely to get sick. So cortisol, it is a useful therapeutic drug. We can exploit the immunosuppressant effect. That is helpful if you are getting an organ transplant, and so it helps prevention of rejected prevent the rejection of transplanted organs. And it also is useful to inhibit inflammatory responses. That's why these steroid inhalers that people with asthma take, that's strongly anti-inflammatory and sort of calms down the inflammation that's going on in the airways. It blocks the airways to some extent or narrows them down. So anyway, so cortisol is a useful therapeutic drug, but too much or too little of the hormone that ends up in a cortisol pathology. And so let's take a look at that. First up here, hypercortisolism. That means you have too much cortisol. So we said it's an immunosuppressant, so that means it makes it more likely to get sick. And you also end up with water accumulations that give you this moon face, kind of a very I don't know, just swollen kind of appearance. And so here's some reasons listed why somebody might have too much cortisol. You could have a tumor in the adrenal cortex that makes cortisol, too much cortisol, or you could have a pituitary tumor that secretes way too much ACTH, and that is known as a Cushing's disease or Cushing's syndrome. And then you could have also a iatrogenic or physician-caused hypercortisolism, and that would be Cushing syndrome, just simply taking too much exogenous cortisol. Now, hypocortisolism, that is associated with something known as Addison's disease, and that would be usually hyposecretion of all adrenal steroid hormones. So I'll take a look at what Cushing syndrome looks like. So this is remember the swollen appearance. You might also end up with stretch marks here. And here's another image that shows what hypersecretion of cortisol might do to you. Here's this lady before she had the Cushing syndrome, and then here you can see all the water accumulations, the typical moon phase, sort of the swollen appearance. And then also personality changes. A lot of people end up with thin skin that bruises easy, and osteoporosis that leads to more easily broken bones. So it has a lot of negative effects, especially really the long-term effect of too much cortisol is not okay. So the moon phase here is listed, upper body obesity. You can see that right here. So too much cortisol is really not a good thing. Here's one more slide that I can show you. This kid before and after having too much cortisol, and there you can definitely see the swelling, a lot of water accumulation. Okay, and so here a list of how CRH from the hypothalamus and the ACTH from the pituitary, how they could play into all of this. It seems that there's an association between stress and the immune function that appears to be mediated through the CRH and the ACTH. So again, the CRH from the hypothalamus and the ACTH from the pituitary. The CRH, so the corticotropin releasing hormone family, includes the CRH and urocortin, and there's a link to several mood disorders. So it's a lot of times it's a good idea if somebody is depressed or has some sort of a mood disorder. It's a good idea to check hormone levels, especially cortisol levels, and also thyroid levels. Hypothyroidism can lead to depression, so it's a good idea to rule out endocrine linked kind of mood problems. So before we move on to thyroid hormones, I think I'm just gonna make that a separate section here for the thyroid hormones. So this is all I have on the cortisol pathologies.